You're listening to a Lutheran Conversation with your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. So hello and welcome to another episode of a Lutheran Conversation. I'm your host, Reverend Jake Zabel, the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. A Lutheran Conversation is a conversation-style podcast brought to you by the Order of Knight George. The Order of Knight George is a media ministry that we have, and it's an Australian-based media ministry. We do everything from books to podcasts to papers. If you want to find anything on the Order of Knight George, you can find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, Facebook, or just go directly to our website, www.knightgeorge.info. And then before we get on with our guests, I'd just like to thank our sponsor for this episode, Concordia Chandlery. If you're looking for homemade, handcrafted candles for your church, you can find Concordia Candlery on Facebook. They'll make church candles, Christ candles, baptism candles, wedding candles. Basically, you name it, they've got a candle for the occasion. And yeah, just find them on Facebook, and you can follow the details there of how to purchase candles. Just disclaimer though, at the moment I think they're only posting Australia-wide, so if you're listening from America, we probably can't post to you at this time, but who knows. With that, we got our guest on for today, Pastor Michael. Pastor Michael, would you like to introduce yourself and tell people what congregation you serve, what synod you belong to, where you're located, etc.?
Absolutely. My name is Michael Church, and Pastor Jake asked just before we started if that really was my name, and I promise it is, Michael Church. I am a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, in its Virginia Synod, and we use the word synod in a sort of idiosyncratic way in the ELCA. And I serve a congregation in Northern Virginia called Our Savior Lutheran Church in the town of Warrenton.
Alrighty, so the second question we have for these conversations is a brief history about your journey through Lutheranism, how you got to where you are today ministering in the ELCA.
Okay, my pleasure. I was born and raised in the Hudson Valley, which is a part of New York State, just due north of New York City, about 100 miles. And my grandfather was a Lutheran pastor in New York City his whole life. My mom was what we call in America, I don't know if other people use the expression, a PK, a preacher's kid. And they notoriously have all sorts of complex issues with their faith as they get older. So I was raised sort of half in and half out of the church in my earliest years. It was primarily something I experienced when visiting my grandparents, and I experienced it very physically. I mean, we'd go to worship, but I also had the entire large building as, my playground during the week. As a very small boy. So I grew up with those very happy memories, but not much experience.
So is this in the ELCA?
Well, it's in our predecessor body, which confusingly for those of you in Australia was called the LCA, the Lutheran Church in America. And so that was one of the three bodies that later formed to join the ELCA. Meanwhile, we had our very small, and I mean very small, local parish church up in the mountains in a small town. And I wasn't really much of a regular there before the age of about 10, when for whatever reason my parents decided Christian education time had come. And boy, did I fight it. I was a perfectly adequate Sunday school student, but I was I think, what teachers call a handful. I resented being there, and I made sure that they knew it. My confirmation teacher, many years later, remembered looking down at the class, all sitting in our pews at the age of 12 or something, and asked where little Michael was, and nobody said anything, and they all looked at their feet the way kids do when they don't want to rat each other out. And he asked again, they looked at their feet again, and he suddenly realized what they meant. He got down on his stomach, and there I was, commando crawling out under the pews. I was that kid. And although I was, as I say, a perfectly adequate student, that resentment stayed with me, so that I made the somewhat unusual decision not to be confirmed when I had finished the courses. And that was a big deal in my family. I was the oldest child and the oldest grandchild, and relatives both younger and older looked at me with shock. My parish pastor handled it magnificently, as oddly enough did my grandfather, who was by then retired. And it took me a few more years. It took me quite a few more years, actually, to work my way back into the church. I had to grow up a great deal, had to sort of find my way as a young adult, go through some personal crises and some family crises. And one thing led to another, and there I was, sitting in church one day, sort of desperately listening for the word of God and hearing it. And then I went back another day and another day after that, and one thing led to another. So that really is the story in a nutshell. I started seminary, which, again, I realize this varies from one country to another. In the United States, it's a graduate program typically. So I'd been out of my undergraduate education for a number of years, and I thought I'd dip my toe into the water. I didn't have a clear sense of pastoral vocation, but I was curious about the experience and about deepening my knowledge base. So I enrolled in seminary, and it's very funny. I don't know when it shifted, but I do know that when I sat down, my first day of internship, which I did, sort of after my Master of Divinity degree and before some further work. My first day of internship, my supervisor was a gruff old former Missourian, and we talked for an hour or so. He said, "Well, usually with vicars, I've got to do a lot of work on their sense of vocation. I can tell you're going to do this for the rest of your life, so we'll skip all that." And he was pretty much right. He had me pegged from day one.
And so, what year then were you ordained?
Would have been August of 1996.
Cool. Alrighty.
As I recall. I'm an old man. Just in case, since this is all audio, I should let you know I have gray hair, and right now I'm working on some gray beard scruff because I'm just finishing vacation. So yeah, I'm old and gray.
I just like to think of people serving since then, and the fact that I was born 94, so when you started ministering, I was still only a toddler.
That's funny. I really, that really does amuse me.
So how many congregations have you really served in the Elka there? Have you stayed put, or have you moved around quite a bit?
No, I've moved around. I've moved around far more than the usual. So, as an ordained pastor, in one capacity or another, I served two congregations before I was ordained in different student capacities. And then as an ordained pastor, I started out in the South Bronx, which is one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York City, and really one of the toughest neighborhoods in the United States in terms of poverty. And in those days, it was coming through the worst of its time as a location for really violent crime, but there was still plenty of it. I was there for 3 years. Then I did a little bit of interim work at a second congregation. Then I was called as the associate, the low man on the totem pole at quite a large church in the New York suburbs for a couple of years. Then my wife is also a pastor, and she was offered a really unique opportunity. And so I traveled with her back to the Hudson Valley, where I was from, did a little interim work up there in a city called Newburgh. You can see how this goes. And then after Newburgh, I was back in New York City for about 4 years. And then we were given the really unique opportunity to serve as English language missionaries to the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Romania on behalf of our synod. And so we spent 3 years there. And by the time that was over and we finally moved back to the United States, I was done moving. My son never wanted to take another plane ride as long as he lived. I never wanted to fill out mobility papers again as long as I lived. So we have settled down quite happily in Virginia. And we've been here now for almost 8 years. Okay.
So you've been quite happy with the ELCA, I'm assuming?
Oh, define happy. Sure. It's my church. I grew up in one of its earlier incarnations, which was a different church than the one I've served in. But I was ordained into it. I've lived in it, my whole adult life, basically. Does that mean I don't sometimes shake my head in despair? Is there anyone who doesn't sometimes shake their head in despair at what the church, as they experience it, is actually like? So sure, I like it. I'm committed to it. It's where I live and breathe and have my being, as somebody else said in an entirely different context about someone much more important. But yeah, it's my church.
So on the spectrum then of the more progressive to the more conservative members of the ELCA, whereabouts would you find yourself?
That's an excellent question, Jake. That's a really good question and a difficult one to answer. Because the terms are too simple. At the very least, you have to think of it, at the very least, you have to think of it as a sort of an XY grid with, four quadrants. So you've got, socially progressive and socially conservative, but then you've also got, liturgically progressive or conservative, and you've also got confessionally or theologically progressive and conservative. So it's really, you need at least 6 boxes. And it's easy in the ELCA, and I imagine in other church bodies, to be, progressive as all get out in one of those boxes, and, as they say, conservative as Attila the Hun in the other, and then to be somewhere in the middle range on the third. So in terms of myself, it's interesting. Much of my ministry has been done, not the earliest years, which were quite different, but much of my ministry has been done among people who are themselves very politically conservative. And even if I don't necessarily share views, and I'm a New Yorker, you would not expect me to. I'm actually from Woodstock, New York, like the one the songs are about, and that Woodstock, raised with hippies. So there's, I'm conservative compared to the people I grew up with, but they all wore bandanas and lived in teepees. I'm less conservative than a lot of the church members I've worked with, but I have learned to understand their positions on political and social issues and to take them seriously and to be thoughtful about them. Even and sometimes to be challenged by them, to let my own convictions be challenged. Liturgically, I'd say I really am probably about, by nature, I'm probably about as conservative as you can get. I'm not sure there's a little bit of room beyond me, but it's almost into eccentricity. And then in terms of theology, again, this probably won't mean anything to your listeners outside the United States and probably outside of mainline Protestantism in the United States. But my wife and I met at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is a Presbyterian Church USA seminary. So it sounds very mainline. But of the large East Coast seminaries, it's definitely the one that has staked out the most neo-Orthodox into evangelical territory. And we were educated in that environment. And I think a lot of our theological impulses and instincts are probably shaped by that, as well as by, in my case especially, learning the confessions in that environment as a Lutheran among Presbyterians, a Lutheran among Calvinists, having to constantly sort of sharpen your wits against theirs confessionally. So we both tend to be, and I certainly tend to be pretty conservative confessionally.
Just on that then, as far as I've understood it, the ELCA takes a more Quantanus subscription to the Book of Concord. So for my listeners that don't know, that's Latin for insofar as, so they will accept some parts of the Book of Concord, but not all of it. Firstly, is that accurate representation of the ELCA, and would you consider yourself more Quantanus or quia? And again, for the listeners who don't know, quia is the Latin phrase for because. So basically, they accept all of the Book of Concord because it agrees with Scripture.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say, it's really nice to be asked that, because I have not been asked. I don't know that I've ever been asked that. I've been waiting, 30 years now for somebody to put it that way. It's just delightful. We don't really, that language is not sort of common coin. And the reason is it harks back in the United States to some of our ugliest internal debates in the 1850s through the 1870s and 80s. Which was an interesting time to be a Lutheran, but reading the literature from that period, I mean, they were rough on each other, and so we try as best we can not to get trapped in old categories. But since you ask, using those categories, yeah, I definitely put myself in the Quatanus, or in the quia rather, category. That is to say, I subscribe to the confessions because they reflect the Word of God, not with the little reservation insofar as, meaning I'll bail or they don't. Yeah, I definitely think that describes me, and I would say probably most of my colleagues, although again, that's not language that we really, it's not the sort of thing we sit around over coffee asking each other. And there certainly is, and this is certainly true, there is a wide range of approaches, particularly in my experience among younger pastors. There's a wide range of approaches toward the confessions. Now, I should also, let me follow that up before you even get in your next question. I want to add to that, there's a wide range of approaches among individuals. As a church body, our position is pretty clear. I mean, it's staked out on the opening page of our church constitution. And it says, we recognize the script. We recognize Jesus Christ as Jesus Christ. We recognize the scriptures as the living word of God. We recognize the Augsburg Confession as, I forget the exact words, but it's essentially a definitive interpretation. And we recognize the rest of the Book of Concord as further valid interpretations of the Word of God, which is a little weak. I mean, I would prefer it to be stronger, but that's where we stand. And the reason we stand there is that, unlike, say, the other largest Lutheran church body in the United States, the Missouri Synod, our background, our heritage is very complicated, and it includes people from a lot of backgrounds and a lot of debates a lot of national origins and so forth that Missouri basically just excluded from the get-go. But we didn't, because we were formed by this long series of mergers, going back very, very far to early American history. And so, yeah, we've been shaped by church traditions that reflect all the different phases of Lutheran history and heritage, including, unfortunately, things like, the rationalism of the late 17th and 18th centuries.
So the ELCA in America sounds a little bit like kind of the LCA in Australia, but also it's one of its predecessors, the UELCA. So
tell me more about it. I don't
in Australia, in 1966, there was a merger between the UELCA or UELCA and the ELCA or ELCA, not to be confused with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia was actually the Missouri Synod sister congregation, and they were basically Missouri Synod Australia is basically what they were. Whereas the UELCA was a lot more kind of diverse, and that was because of, by the sounds of it, it was from a collection of mergers. So in the 1921, 5 synods in Australia had merged together to form the UELCA. They were then later joined by a 6th synod and a couple other little independent little independent groups that had not officially joined anybody up until the 1920s and early 1930s. They kind of then jumped into they tended to pick a side. For example, there was the St. Andrew's Brisbane congregation that they actually ended up having quite a big fight over who they'd end up joining, and it split the congregation on, I think, the actual St. Andrews stayed with they ended up joining the UELCA, and the splinter group who formed Bethlehem ended up joining the ELCA. So there were a few little groups around that hadn't belonged to either group and then had to make a decision of which way they wanted to go. But UELCA was a member of the Lutheran World Federation back then in the 90s and the mid-1900s. And then what happened was in 1966, those two groups decided to merge. And part of the agreement was also that they'd cut all international ties. So the ELCA cut their ties with Missouri, and the UELCA left the Lutheran World Federation. So they couldn't retain any ties outside of Australia, except they did retain their ties with the Papua New Guinea churches, but that was mostly because, especially at that time, Australia was still basically sending a lot of missionaries to Papua New Guinea.
As it happens, I was in Papua New Guinea last year with an ELCA group, visiting some of visiting the ELC PNG and some of our own partners over there. And I learned a little bit about that. And I certainly got a strong sense of the importance of the Australian Lutheran mission presence there. And yeah, I think there's still, if I remember correctly, some of that still affects why the Good News and ELC PNG churches are separate. It's something connected to that period, although it's all a little up.
It's to do with all their founding churches, and
it sounds comparable.
But yeah, so basically listening to how you talked about. Yeah, how you talked about how the ELCA in America is kind of a bit of a, if I'm correct, a mixed bag, because they kind of had so many different mergers.
Definitely.
You really had that. So
absolutely.
So in Australia, when the UELCA formed, like I said, eventually there was basically 6 synods that made that church, and 3 of those synods were from more of the Union Lutherans, so they'd come from the state church of Prussia. They were generally a bit more liberal, progressive kind of. They're probably people today would probably consider them conservative, but for their days they were pretty progressive. And then on the other hand, there was the other three groups were, well, they were more of that old Lutheran, more really conservative, confessional, to some degree even pietistic, legalist Lutherans to some degree. One of those synods that made up these 6 synods that formed the ULCA, they had formerly belonged to the Australian ELCA, and so they had previously been connected with Missouri, but they had some falling out, and they split off and actually joined up with Ohio, and this also led to the ULCA having fellowship with the American Lutheran Church, so the ALC, another one of the founding synods of the ELC over there in America. So you had those kind of situations there. Well, one of the groups that had formed the ULCA, or they later joined the ULCA, they'd actually split from the Australian ELCA, and had then, so they'd formerly been in fellowship with Missouri, and then when they split, they went and entered into fellowship with the then Ohio Synod,
right,
which would later go on to merge with a bunch of synods to form the American Lutheran Church, which then this then led to the ULCA in Australia having fellowship with the American Lutheran Church, the ALC, which I believe was again one of the main 3 bodies that formed the ELCA in America. Yeah.
Now, one of our predecessors, yeah. Now, it's a little confusing because there's the American Lutheran Church 1930 and the American Lutheran Church 1960, and they're technically different, but they're all part of the predecessor bodies, as I recall. Yeah, and right, now that's interesting. I didn't know all that. I really know almost nothing about Lutheranism in Australia. So.
But that's why the ULCA, probably like the ELCA in America, was a bit of a mixed bag, having all these different mergers. You got a couple synods that are more liberal, a couple synods that are more conservative through to pietist. And then what happens is you get this then merger in the 1966, and has then kind of passed that on to the LCA, because when you take a Missouri Synod church and basically be like, what would happen if you took the current ELCA and the current Missouri Synod, merged them into one big church? You know, what would that be like? And that's kind of the LCA in Australia. It's a mixture of...
That's really interesting, and that helps me understand it much better.
We've got some pastors, like there's some pastors in Australia that actually were ordained and trained in the ELCA, and some that were even ordained and trained in the Missouri Synod. So
sure,
the Lutheran Church of Australia does have a very big mixed bag, and I think it's got, as you're talking about your church's statement on like the confessions, you said it's a bit weak, and so that often sometimes leads to a bit of wiggle room and variation among the ministers. And I think the LCA in Australia has tended to do that. I know back in the 80s and 90s, they had a big argument here in Australia about the question of the inerrancy of Scripture. And while the LCA did say, they did write a statement that does say, we hold to the inerrancy of Scripture, it's written in such a way that there is a lot of wiggle room for pastors in the church. So you have some pastors that will take like a real literal inerrancy of Scripture, that everything is exactly inerrant, there's no problems. And then you've got other pastors in the LCA, they'll say things like, oh, well, I believe the scriptural teachings are inerrant. So when Jesus talks about love and forgiveness, that's inerrant. But, you know, when it talks about Jesus walking on water, well, I don't believe that's inerrant. So, I mean, we do have, the LCA does have pastors on both ends of the spectrum there, and that comes from this idea of like the mixed bag and the weak statements. And so it sounds like the ELCA has a bit of that too.
It is. I think that's exactly correct. I mean, we're a big tent church in terms of our history. We are put together from all the same strands you mentioned, and many others that I could mention. I mean, there have been Lutherans in North America since the mid 1600s, and you know they came from different national backgrounds, And within the national groups and language groups, they came from different ecclesiastical backgrounds, often quite different as pietism developed, and again, rationalism and romanticism, and then the 19th century liberalism. And all of these things got fought out both in Europe and then separately in America. And then there were all these little groups, and then they all multiplied, and then they'd gotten it kind of worked out by the early mid-19th century, and then there was this massive wave of immigration and a bunch of new ideas and a bunch of new church backgrounds entered the mix, and it took a long time to get to where we are. And I mean, our immediate predecessor bodies are the mostly Scandinavian low church pietistic ALC, the mostly German East Coast based, somewhat more high church LCA, and the wild card of the very small but very vocal AELC, which was a bunch of people who'd left the Missouri Synod during its big conflicts in the 70s. And so, and they were an interesting bunch, and in the early years of the ELC, a very disproportionately influential bunch. And so it's up right there, even forgetting the whole complex history of each of those three bodies. It took a long time for us even to sort of recognize each other, and we still certainly have simmering debates, but we've learned how to do it with, I have colleagues, including very close colleagues, who I suspect that if we started talking in the language of 19th century confessional debates, from what we think of as the General Synod, General Council era, we'd discover some sharp disagreements immediately. But when we speak in the language of contemporary theology, those differences aren't the pressing differences. We still have differences, mostly of style and of practice, and certainly of worship. But we understand that we're each doing both what our own sort of theological culture has trained us to do, and what, presumably at least, what our communities of faith require. But it's a challenge sometimes. I won't lie about it.
Yeah, well, I've got a few more questions about some of the doctrine in the ELCA. But before we get to that, we'll move to our third question, which is,
okay.
What's a controversial doctrine that you subscribe to? Now, that can be either, it's controversial within all of America or controversial within the LCA.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Go on. Really
good question. So, yeah, I've got a couple here. And it depends what you mean by controversial. So I was, I'm so glad you asked. Okay, so controversial within the ELCA. This is one that when I was first ordained, how old are you?
Me, I'm 26, nearly 27.
You told me, but I forgot. Okay, so I was ordained when I was a few years older than you are. But when I was in my early 30s, this was fighting.
I should be 27 by the time this airs.
Okay, when I was newly ordained, these were fighting words, which is, I have a great deal of, this isn't really a doctrinal subscription exactly, but I have a great deal of respect for and willingness to engage with the Anglican idea of the historic episcopate. I think it's a valuable gift to the church, and one that we're wise to engage with. And believe you me, I could say that at a party when I was newly ordained, and there would practically be a fist fight. I know it sounds kind of obscure, but its very obscurity speaks to the deep differences within the ELCA growing out of the varying heritages. So people trained, basically anybody who was, in those years at least, who had been trained at our largest seminary, the one in St. Paul, Minnesota, would have fought me to the death over that assertion, and in fact, some were willing to try. Whereas we in the East Coast were much more open to it, because our experience of Anglicanism had been very, very different, as well as our liturgical. Now, in terms of Lutheranism, in terms of traditional Lutheran stuff, I'm not going to lie to you. I sometimes wiggle on the number of uses of the law, and I sometimes wish that the Formula of Concord phrased the usus triplex a little bit differently. I'm not sure that in the 21st century, the primary use of the law being to terrify consciences is nearly as powerful a description as it was in the 16th century. And so if I were going to negotiate on something that would get me in trouble with an examining board, that would probably be it.
What would be, like, within more like American Lutheranism that you think would be controversial? Like something like you're in the ELCA that might something that might you're in the ELCA, something you might say that might tick off all the other non-ELCA synods.
Well, actually, in all seriousness, I was joking a little bit, but what I said about the historic episcopate really seriously would tick off a lot of them, and then others it would not. That is much more serious than you might think. Let me think of other stuff. I mean, I'm also I need to confess, I'm generally kind of obnoxious and contrarian. So ticking off my colleagues is something I do almost, or at least I used to when I was younger, do almost as a hobby. And I can't remember some of the good ones anymore. But I mean, look, my wife is ordained. And so, the fact that I'm married to a female pastor, certainly with some very rigorous Missouri Synod pastors and church members, and certainly with Wisconsin, puts up a few barriers to conversation. Although, I also have to say, when we were in the Bronx, both newly ordained, the local Missouri Synod circuit were some of our closest friends and mentors, and we really relied on them. So it's not all as clear-cut as it seems.
Well, that leads into another question then, that you obviously don't have a problem then with the ordination of women and some of those more positions really of the ELCA?
I really don't. I with women, I mean, when I was the LCA, our predecessor, the American LCA, began ordaining women in 1970 when I was a boy, and at first, I was a little kid. I thought it was kind of weird, but what did I know? And then I actually met a few women pastors, and once I got over the the childish kind of culture shock, I started taking it for granted. And then actually, while I was in seminary, my home parish, little tiny country church, was served by its first female pastor, and she was extraordinary, just extraordinary. And I got to see her up close and personal fairly often and in action, and we actually became fairly good friends, as I became with her husband. And she was as confessional and as liturgical as a pastor as you could hope for. And any doubts I might still have had by then, and I'm not sure I had any, but they were certainly wiped away by that experience.
Whew. I mean, that would be probably one of the big disagreements between us then, because I would hold to the more traditional position of male-only ordination, be more in line with, well, not just Missouri Synod, Missouri, Wells, and a bunch of other synods that have that position. I mean, that's...
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in
Roman
the LCA
Catholicism?
Anymore.
Anglicanism.
I'm not in the LCA anymore. I didn't generally agree with a lot more of the more liberal positions of the LCA, not necessarily just... I mean, the LCA at the moment doesn't have women's ordination. Who knows? They've got another synodical conference this this year, I think in either June or July, so who knows if it will be brought up again. They've voted on it 4 or 5 times already, and
it's one of those issues.
Yeah, it's managed to reach the majority, but the Constitution requires a 2/3 majority for big changes like that, because of, we were talking earlier about the UELCA and the ELCA forming. Neither church back in those days had women's ordination, but the UELCA was a part of the Lutheran World Federation, and there were churches already that had women pastors, and so there was talk in the UELCA of having women's pastors. So when they formed the LCA, there's this foundational doctrine called the Theses of Agreement, and under the office of the ministry, TA 6, point 11, the last of the points, says that the LCA holds that ordination is for males only. Therefore, in order to change the foundational doctrine, the foundational document of their synod, they need the 2/3 majority in order to alter that position, rather than if it was some other issue where they could get the simple 50% majority, they need the 2/3 to change this. And so it's been a big fighting issue in Australia, and they have, I think to some degree, the pro-women's ordination ones overstepped the mark. So basically, 2 conferences ago they voted, and it was there was 11 votes short. So if you had 6 people change their minds and vote for rather than against, it would have got through. And following on from that, the bishop then took it upon himself to declare that the Commission on, I forget the CTICR, Commission on Theology and Interchurch Relations, the bishop commissioned them to, quote, write a statement defending the practice of women's ordination. So he wasn't saying, go research the issue and then come back with your own findings. He said, go write the statement to defend it.
I see.
And so they wrote.
That's funny. I'm sorry.
And so they wrote the statement, which was known as the DDS, or Doctrinal Draft Statement, because the full name was Doctrinal Draft Statement on the Ordination of Both Men and Women to the Office of the Ministry. It had a really long name, so it was just called the DDS for short. And what happened was there were members on the commission who did support women's ordination, and they jumped at the opportunity. And there was a bunch of members on the commission who didn't support women's ordination, and they refused to contribute to it. And so last synodical conference, they weren't voting on the idea of should we allow women's ordination. They were voting specifically on this statement. And I think that that was their problem, because what actually happened was a larger percentage voted against it rather than earlier. So they actually got fewer votes in favour of women's ordination. And I think that happened a lot with people going, I may support women's ordination, but I don't support this particular statement, and so I have to vote it down because I don't want that to be the statement that we're going to hold to.
I understand. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, honestly, number one, I mean, it's simply good church practice to make a foundational document difficult to amend. You don't want to be carried away by it wouldn't make any sense for a church to be carried away by every little passing wind of doctrinal fancy. And again, I'm paraphrasing St. Paul here. It should be slow going. In the United States, I have to say that particular debate, although it had raged for years, when it actually came to the decision, was fairly painless. I mean, I've described my own child's eye view of it, but from the stories I've heard, you know, the actual vote part wasn't that big a deal. Women certainly did were not necessarily treated as equal partners in ministry for a long time. And there's an argument that some are still not, certainly at the parish level. They're not necessarily called as readily and so forth. But it's a big step, and making a big step like that when 30% of your church is militantly against it is probably not a great move. It's probably premature at the very least. So as far as I'm concerned, from speaking from a church that made the decision decades ago, they're welcome to take their time. It sounds like that won't take too much time, but by the time they get there, they'll be principally in agreement.
The thing is with the LCA is they spend so much time fighting over this one issue that's like, just pick a side, have a split, because there's going to be some people that walk out once it comes in. That's for sure. Although I would be surprised to see how many actually do, because I'm really big into studying the history of Lutheranism in Australia, and when the actual union was taken place back in the 1960s, there were dozens of pastors, particularly mostly from Queensland, the state of Queensland, although there were a few in like some of the other states, but there were a lot of pastors in Australia that, particularly from the Elka side, that actually protested the union. They didn't want to unite the two churches. They thought it was better off remaining two separate bodies. But then when the union happened, there was a single pastor in about 6 congregations that actually refused the union and walked out. So even though there were dozens that protested it, only one left. And then again, during the 1980s, when they had the big debates in the LCA over inerrancy, again, there was heaps of pastors who were arguing about this. They didn't like the statement that was put forth. They thought it was too weak. They needed something stronger. And yet, in the end, only 3 pastors and their handful of congregations that went with them actually ended up leaving the LCA, and they formed a group called the AELC, the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church. And so, we've had in the past, there's been like, a reasonable sized group that disapproves of something, but when it actually gets voted in, you got like 1 or 2 people that actually will stand up and say, I'll leave. So while there are heaps of pastors in the LCA that object to women's ordination and say, if this comes in, I'll leave, I think there's only going to be a few of them will actually have the guts to leave if it actually ever happens. Most of them will just put up with it and stay.
I suspect that you and I differ on what I'm about to say, but I actually am quite charmed by that. I have a lot of respect for that. There's a great deal to be said for saying this is my church, and even if I don't necessarily agree with everything it does, it is still my church, and I will serve it faithfully. I suppose everyone has a breaking point, and everyone should have a breaking point. You think about the German Christian movement of the 1930s, obviously, but in a great many things, I've disagreed with my church over the years about all sorts of things, and rather than fomenting a schism in search of, and this is really where I think my critique of some of my former Missourian colleagues and friends has been over the years. Rather than going on an endless quest for the perfect church wherever it may be, deciding to live with the imperfect church that you know exactly where it is. And when I talk about former colleagues, I'm really thinking of an older generation, people like Yaroslav Pelikan or Richard Newhouse, who or any number of other people I could name, who wandered from Missouri into the LCA, into Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism, because they had in their idea this sort of Platonic form of the church that they wanted to experience in reality. And what can I tell you? I'm a nominalist. I think the the categories are names for things rather than realities. Sorry, that was a little obscure. But
I think we would probably disagree. I would take probably more of a stricter view on church fellowship and thinks there needs to be more doctrinal unity. I mean, I know, like you talk about, there is this, you got to avoid the errors of, I think you got to avoid the errors of unionism on one hand and sectarianism on the other hand. So you like, I think you need to have breaking points, and like, I wouldn't stay in groups like the ELCA or stuff like that. But then at the same time, yeah, you don't want to be these sectarians where you're constantly splitting and then like, basically, I'm the only true Christian on earth and everybody else is wrong.
There's that old joke about the the guy who's stranded on a desert island for 20 years alone, and when they pick him up, there's his hut, and then there are two other huts, and they say, "What are the other huts?" He says, "Well, that one's my church." And they say, "Well, what's that other hut, the third one?" He says, "Oh, that's where I used to go to church, but we had a split." I mean, you don't want to be in that situation. But I do understand there's a long and noble tradition of saying, these are my commitments and I'm not willing to budge on them. And at a certain point, everybody has to have one of those. I mean, if your church is actually taken over by the outright forces of evil, then yeah, you get the heck out of there as fast as you can. On the other hand, loyal opposition also has a place.
I think there's also the idea of the commitment of the pastor to your call. So, like, some things can be a bit different. So, like, in my circumstances, I went from the LCA to the AELC to now in the COELC, but I wasn't ordained the COELC is where I was ordained. So it's a little bit easier for them to move churches when I'm not ordained. But, like, I think as a pastor, you took a call to this congregation and you have to stand firm. And so, like, if your congregation, like, if it was in the LCA and the LCA started ordaining women and you say, well, I'm not supporting this, well, then your congregation either supports you in that or they don't support you, and then you get kicked, then you get, defrocked or kicked out or whatever. So,
or if they have extremely strong feelings about it, you either support them or you don't. I mean, I do understand that. If you find yourself, and certainly at the practical parish level, there's always the possibility, and it may not be for doctrinal reasons at all, there's always the possibility that a pastor will find himself, or herself in our case, unable to conduct effective ministry in a certain place at a certain time. And doctrine can be because of doctrine, or it can be because of other things. But when that's true, there may be some merit to sticking it out. Sometimes things change, but there may also be great wisdom in, as we say in the United States, getting out of Dodge. It may be that relationship has run its course. And, sure, if your whole congregation believes something that you don't believe, that would be that time.
So this brings me to then probably another question I have regarding the ELCA, and we're still in the question of controversial doctrines. So basically the homosexual issue. So I know there's the groups, the NELC and the LCMC. I don't know exactly when they split and what exactly the splits were over, but generally I believe both of them had some objection to the ELCA and the homosexual issue. So if you know the histories of those two, that would be helpful.
Sure. No, I absolutely do. I do know their histories. I don't have all the details ready to mind, but basically it goes like this. The LCMC predates the ELCA's decision to ordain gay people, and actually its original cause, if I'm not mistaken, it grows out of, and I may be confusing the two here, it grows out of a movement called the Word Alone movement, which originally objected in the strongest possible terms to our full communion agreement with the Episcopal Church in the 1990s. They really deeply took umbrage at that. And what they attempted to form was not a new church body at the time, but some form of, I don't want to call it a shadow synod. That's a good phrase for it. I didn't want to call it a confessing movement because that's giving it a little more dignity than it actually had. But a shadow synod, an association or a fellowship, if you like, of pastors and congregations who thought that Episcopalians were stinky, to put it, sort of colloquially. And then the NALC.
So that was the LCMC group,
right? And as far as I know, they are not. Now, I may be mistaken. My information here may be out of date. They later jumped on the gay bandwagon, and made that one of their rallying cries. But and I'm not sure if they now think of themselves as an independent denomination or not. For a long time, they were encouraging congregations to be duly aligned, to be, stay in the ELCA, but also put your name on the LCMC roster and come to our meetings and what have you. And I have a friend who actually made that decision. I actually have a couple of friends who made that decision, but one very dear friend. And I believe that his congregation has now left the ELCA and is only aligned with the LCMC. And I find that he's a very old friend and someone I really treasure. And it makes me very sad, but I do understand that both for him and for the congregation, it was a matter of really deeply held principle. It is not that they hadn't looked at the pros and cons. It wasn't that they hadn't thought it through or that they were simply being reactive. So I don't want to, I certainly don't want to be bad-mouthing the organization, although I've had some unkind things to say about them over the years. The NALC I know a little better, and they have their roots in another sort of protest movement called Lutheran Core, Committee on Renewal or something like that. They just called themselves Core, C-O-R-E. And they were pretty much prepared. They saw the writing was in the, or that the, they saw that the decision on sexuality was coming. And they were, as soon as it was made, they were ready to go. And they, I think that week or that month, announced the creation of a new church body, the North American Lutheran Church. And it consists, they may have done a few mission starts now, but it consists principally of churches that either the whole congregation broke away from the ELCA or quite frequently, and this happened in the case of the congregation I serve now, some members broke away and formed a new smaller church down the street. So it happens, and it's like something like 10% of our total membership, I think, wound up joining it. So they're a significant small church body consisting of they ordained both men and women, but they really had strong feelings about homosexuality, and I do understand their feelings without necessarily sympathizing with them. I also have to say that in some cases their tactics were highly questionable in the early years, but a lot of that has settled down now, a decade or so down the pike.
So we would take it then that you support the ELCA's position on gay ordination and gay marriage?
I have wrestled with it a little bit over the years, but what I value in ministry is effective communication of the gospel. And I'm from New York, so my many gay colleagues include, that not every single one is a brilliant expositor, but they include some tremendously faithful servants of the church. And so I can't really, in conscience, object to their ordination. Did I, at an earlier time in my life, have some reservations about whether marriage was an institution that could be extended to them? The answer is, I did have reservations at one time. our society has moved on, and my thinking about marriage has changed a bit over the years. So I support it, but I support it with a full understanding of why somebody might not, and I am able, unlike some of my more doctrinaire colleagues, I'm able to have a civil conversation with and respect people who feel differently. As one of my bishops years ago, the late William Lazarus, who was a very well-known ecumenist and later bishop of the Metropolitan New York Synod, he put it very simply once, and this is back in the 1980s, I think. He said, the church has always ordained gay people. The question is, what has it asked of them when it ordains them? And he's right, of course. I mean, there was, it has normally asked celibacy of them, and that they not identify themselves by their desires, which, identifying yourself by your sexual desire is kind of stupid when you think about it, but that's a separate issue. People have chosen to in our culture for whatever reason. But primarily what it's asked for them of celibacy. We stopped asking for that. I can't really object too deeply, no. I want for my colleagues the same happiness and satisfaction in marriage that I've had for myself. And I also know that it will make them, many of them at least, will be better and more complete people and pastors for it.
So to clarify then further, you wouldn't consider homosexuality a sin?
That is an interesting question. And one I'm not going to lie, I've wrestled with it. So when I was younger, and when this whole debate was at an earlier stage, the question I asked myself was, what do you mean by homosexuality? Do you mean the desire, or do you mean the action? And if so, are we then limiting sin simply to discrete actions and denying its Pauline character as this overwhelming alien force that holds everybody in its grasp outside of grace? And so I struggled with that for years and years. And finally it started to sound stale as I asked myself those questions. But I hesitate to talk in terms of homosexuality as a whole. Do I consider two men making a lifelong commitment to one another inherently sinful? No, I don't. Do I consider a man who runs around having promiscuous sex with people of his own sex or anybody or the other one to be sinful? Yeah, I do. I can't really approve of that. Can I nonetheless recognize in him a child of God who needs to be, called to repentance and then forgiven? Yes, easily.
I was going to just comment there because you made the question about you said two men making a commitment. Because I've found sometimes there's this weird, I deem it weird, something that I've found emerging in more modern people where there's this idea of homosexual, but it's not really homosexual. It's more like homophilia. And what I mean by that is that there's this weird concept of what I've heard people talk about, celibate homosexual relationships. And I say that's a contradiction in terms because you can't be celibate and sexual. It just doesn't make any sense. But what they're meaning in is like, but like two men that live together, but they don't have sexual desire for each other and they don't have sex with each other. I'm like, well, then they're just two straight guys living together and there's nothing wrong with that. And, I think there has been sometimes more in this modern age of really conflating lust and love together to the point where people see homosexuality wherever love exists. So I look at the examples of King David and Jonathan. They loved each other. They were great friends. David makes the point that he says he loves Jonathan more than women. But I would argue they weren't homosexuals. They didn't have sexual intercourse to each other. But that doesn't mean two men can't love each other. I mean, I don't know if you guys have this term in America. We have in Australia, we had this concept of mateship, that you know, men that were like willing to die for each other, and that, you know, they would enjoy and love their male friends more than their wives and that, but they never had sexual relations with them.
Yeah, the only word we have for that is camaraderie, because we just don't use mate the same way that Australians or Brits
I think that's, you hear the term bromance.
But certainly that concept that you're describing. Oh, right, exactly. But I'll also say that what you're describing, bromance, it's very funny. Bromances, that's been a part of life as long as there's been life. It's hardly novel. It's well documented in antiquity. It's extremely well documented in the 19th century. You get there's a bit of an argument over John Henry Newman, but you know, he certainly asked that his ashes or that his bones be buried commingled with those of his lifelong friend. And of course, there's society being what it is, there's an argument over whether he and his friend were lovers or not. But in any case, they were both celibate Roman Catholic priests. So the point is, if you view sexuality purely as a series of actions, then the point is moot. If you view it as an identification, I don't know what they did in private, how they thought of each other or themselves in private, but the concept of homosexuality has emerged from their time forward, was still pretty new in their time, so it's quite likely it just wasn't how they talked or thought. So I mean, I'm not pretending these aren't complicated questions, and I'm not pretending that taking a position on them is a simple thing that a person can do reflectively. And the other thing is, and this comes up in the conversation we're having right now, the terminology and the social perceptions of things change so fast that theology is a little challenged to keep up. I mean, the theological category that these sort of physical relationships get categorized historically as sodomy, a term that actually, at least in American law, has a completely different set of meanings. And so it just gets really confusing.
But that's what I mean, yeah. You've got this...
I really, again...
I was going to say, yeah, you've got this weird thing now where, like, I would definitely say homosexuality is a sin, but you've got this weird concept now of people are confusing sexuality and just like camaraderie. Like, they're, you know, if two guys want to be like we were talking about, a bromance, they're straight, they don't have any sexual desires for each other, they want to live together, they want to spend time together. Yeah, that's there's nothing wrong in that. The issue is which sexual acts and sexual desires. I mean, the Bible talks about the fact that, you know, Jesus talks about that it's not just physical sleeping with people, but if you have lust in your heart, that's also on the same category of sin.
Well, and this is, of course, and that's actually really important, because there's a tendency in these conversations, or at least there has been in my experience over the last 20 years or so, there has been a strong tendency to focus the whole discussion on homosexuality, whereas in fact the church's historic conversation is about sexuality full stop, which is to say, lust, which is, historically considered to be, a very serious sin by itself because it distracts people's attention from God. Concupiscence. Paul shows, clearly in his letter to the Corinthians, shows that he's wrestling with it. On the one hand, I want you all to be celibate the way I am celibate. On the other hand, I know that marriage is necessary, so that as a remedy for burning. for sexual lust. So therefore we allow it, go ahead and do it. But I gotta tell you, I've still got my doubts. I mean, that's a very crude paraphrase, but that's how that chapter reads. And all through the history of Christianity, there's been this struggle. In the East, the tradition is that, priests can marry, but if they want to be bishops, they can't marry. And monk priests are sort of elevated somewhat over married priests. Why? Because marriage itself is considered a bit suspect. It's a sign of moral weakness. It's a sign that you have some other commitment besides your commitment to God or perhaps to the church. And that has gotten lost in discussions among Lutherans, frankly, among modern Roman Catholics, among Protestants, because of the new language that's emerged out of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The whole, categorizing homosexuality as this sort of like separate way of being a human being. In fact, biblically and theologically, historically, the question has always been, are you able to dedicate yourself entirely to God, or do you need to make other commitments for the sake of being able to function on a day-to-day basis, and know that the church will regard you?
I think one thing I would mention there, I think you had a good point of a lot of people tend to focus on homosexuality, whereas the issue seems to be more just sexuality in general. And this was, I remember, years and years ago, I remember making a podcast on this where I brought up this issue where people talk about the marriage is between one man and one woman for life, forsaking all others. And then everybody's arguing about the changing the one man and one woman to, one man and one man, or one woman to one woman. And I said, well, what about the for life, forsaking all others? I mean, the Bible also has issues with promiscuity, sex before marriage, adultery, divorce. All these other things are big issues and that's what I've said. When Australia had the gay marriage vote here a few years back, I forget even when that was now. That's right, it's end of 2017. So that's when they had it. And I remember people were getting all worried about it, oh, this is going to destroy the estate of marriage. And I remember saying to them, I said, gay marriage isn't the straw it's not the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, the back's been broken. Gay marriage is another straw being placed on the pile already. The camel's back was broken some time ago. We've got, in Australia, we've got de facto relationships. Divorce is happening. People don't wait till marriage to have sex. People commit adultery all the time. I'm like, the estate of marriage was long deteriorated. Homosexuality is just the next thing to add to the pile.
Right. And I will say, I think of it a little differently, but I'm in agreement with the general direction here, except for thinking of gay marriage as a straw on the camel's back. Instead, I would describe it as, and this is going to sound crazy to you, I realize, but as almost a last attempt to preserve the institution of marriage. In an age when men and women are increasingly reluctant to do it, and then when they do it, increasingly unserious about it, we have men and men, or women and women, who are desperate to try it out, hoping that they can make a better go of it. I'm also going to tell you that the evidence so far doesn't seem to be that they're making a particularly better go of it than straight people, but what have you. And I'm certainly as a pastor going to encourage a lifelong faithful commitment over promiscuity any day of the week. And we don't live in a society that even recognizes celibacy very clearly as an option, and has a lot of trouble talking about it or understanding it or conceptualizing it. So, I also have to recognize I'm working with people for whom that's not a meaningful category. Well, what's the alternative? I'd rather they not burn with lust and make foolish decisions.
I think what I would note is most interesting is, like I said, I think we disagree much on the homosexual issue, but one thing I do appreciate here, and this is something that I'm trying to do with these podcasts of a Lutheran Conversation, is to have, civil conversations and say, hey, we disagree, but I mean, the part of the podcast is to say, yeah, there's disagreements in Lutheranism. There's differences in Lutheranism. Let's sit down and talk about what are those differences and why are there differences. And
I think that's very valuable. It's especially valuable, Jake, and I want to commend you for the commitment to civil discourse, because so much of the Lutheran heritage is of uncivil discourse. So much of our theological heritage is of, just vicious nitpicking and, endless broadsides against each other.
Name calling.
The rabies theologorum, it's theologorum. It's just, it's good to be entering a phase where Lutherans who disagree thoughtfully can have a discussion about that without it turning into an exchange of slanderous pamphlets.
Well, that's what like I said, you were mentioning earlier that I think you said you could have much more civil conversations on this than some of your colleagues, and I really appreciate that. I like that, I've said to you, I think homosexuality is a sin, I don't agree with women's ordination, etc., etc., and you haven't just yelled at me and called me a sexist, bigot, homophobe, or whatever list of names I've been called in the past by people. Yeah. I find it very disappointing when people can't even disagree with me. They're like, what? You say that? You're evil. Got to call your names, and that's that. I'm like, well, then we get nowhere. I can't convince you, and you can't convince me.
Right. I mean, that's exactly it. And the name calling doesn't really serve any meaningful purpose, and it certainly does a profound disservice to the kingdom of God, as well as to the reputation of the church. It doesn't do much good to, those Christian ministers always fighting with each other.
And I mean, and it doesn't help for even just like convincing each other of our positions. I mean, I can remember a situation back. I was still studying at seminary at that stage, and I was down in the Adelaide Rundle Mall there, and there were these they were part of the University Marxist Society or whatever, and they were sitting there doing some protest against Trump's travel ban, which they were calling his Muslim ban, and I was asking what they were doing, and then they're like, oh, do you agree with this? I'm like, yeah, I think it's actually a pretty good idea. And then he just called me, he called me a Nazi, rambled something about the Holocaust. And then when I tried to just say, well, hold on a moment, let's actually think about the logic of this. I was yelled at and told that, they wouldn't talk to me, they would ignore my, quote, hatred. And I'm like, I just said to him, you guys are idiots. Even if you guys are right, how do you ever expect to convince me that I'm wrong if you won't even talk to me and all you're going to do is yell at me? That's not going to make me want to agree with you.
I think that's a very fair question. It is. The failure of civil discourse, and in all seriousness, I mean, here in the United States, we've had a great deal of trouble in recent years in our public life because of the failure of civil discourse among our leaders. I mean, our legislature is barely able to function right now because really it's almost equally divided, and the members are barely speaking to each other. This is not the way to get things done very effectively, and for Christians to behave that way, as historically many of us have, is also not helpful. In a much more profound way. A legislature, well, you just elect new guys, but churches have to be able to talk to each other, and when they disagree, have to be able to disagree respectfully and thoughtfully. I mean, look, some of my dear friends are Roman Catholic and Orthodox, and obviously we disagree about any number of things. Genital issues, by no means the largest or most important. But the ones I'm friends with, we can always respect what is best about each other's faith, and disagree thoughtfully when we don't. The ones I'm not friends with are a challenge sometimes.
See, there's a reason why at the Diet of Augsburg it was, partly also Luther couldn't leave Saxony because he would have been put to death. But there's a reason why Melanchthon was the one who wrote the Augsburg Confession and not Martin Luther. They were actually striving for, at that stage, unity with the Catholics, if possible. And
I will tell you, you asked if I, back when you were asking if I had, any controversial opinions, controversial doctrinal opinions. The other obscure one I didn't mention, besides my weakness for bishops, and so forth. The other obscure one I didn't mention is that in the debates of the 1550s and beyond, I really have great sympathy for the Philippist party in Wittenberg. I am, despite a certain amount of, grudging respect for what they were trying to accomplish, reading the history of that period, I am constantly frustrated by the Gnesiolutherans because they seem so stubborn and they seem so invested in doctrinal purity over anything else, including the unity of the church, which for me is a doctrinal point. Whereas the Philippists, and Melanchthon himself especially, as he said in the preface to the Augsburg Confession, he said, we will omit nothing so far as God and conscience allow that obstructs the unity of the church, or that furthers the unity of the church, rather. And that's, I've tried to live by that as best I can.
Well, with all that, we're around about an hour and a half now, and I normally try to keep these conversations around an hour. But I'm not too fussed if they go over a bit. But so we might as well look at wrapping it up. And so the last question is generally, if we can get I'll get you to give a short answer on this. Is basically, what do you think then is the most important issue that we need to fix in order to fix Lutheranism? So Lutheranism is full of division, there's full of differences. What do you think is the one issue that needs to be sorted out? There's heaps of issues that need to be sorted out, but what is the most important one that you think needs to be fixed?
Wow. Fixing Lutheranism. That's a category I've never considered seriously. In part because I don't think of Lutheranism as broken, although it is certainly divided. And if we were going to find a way to reunite it, or to unite it more effectively, what would we do? That's a challenge. We have the Book of Concord. You wouldn't think we needed anything else. The confessions, the purpose of the confessions, and particularly of the formula, was to achieve this, right? So I suppose we really do need to renew an awareness of and a focus on the Book of Concord as a whole, and not just its details, but also its purpose. If more Lutherans walked around knowing about what's in it and why it's there, it might make it easier for us to have meaningful conversations, which is another way of saying the confessions are the solution.
Well, thank you, Michael, for taking time out of your day to come on for this episode.
That's a treat.
I hope the listeners have enjoyed listening to the episode. And again, I thank you for the civil discourse. I think it's good when we can sit down and, I don't have to scream at you for belonging to a church that has women pastors and gay pastors, and you don't need to scream at me for being part of a really conservative micro-synod.
No, I'm delighted. I was delighted by the invitation, and it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Cool. Well, thank you. Hope you have a good day. Goodbye, and God bless.
Take care. Bye-bye.